So, Francine Prose comes to us tonight with a host of well-received and thoroughly enjoyable books behind her, including Blue Angel, a finalist for the National Book Award, a personal favorite of mine, My New American Life, and the nonfiction Read Like a Writer, which is a must-read for all of us book nerds. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, visiting professor at Bard College, and has served as the president of the PEN American Center. Tonight's book, Lovers at the Chameleon Club, is perhaps morally ambiguous, brightly written, and makes the tension of history invade your room as you read. Taken from a moment captured in a photograph from 1932, Prose's novel follows a fascinating former Olympic hopeful who eventually works for the Gestapo. Paris in the 1930s feels like a fantasy. They're so big, it's so much at stake. And Prose works magic making the dark streets, hot clubs, and huge characters feel real enough to touch. Please join me in welcoming Francine Prose.
Thank you, Hannah. And can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? This works? And thank you, Ron Charles. Thank you, New York Times. I can't express my gratitude enough. So I'm mostly going to talk. I'm going to talk about how the book started and how it was written. And I'm going to read just a few little snippets from it, and then I'm going to answer questions. The book began, as Hannah began to say, it began with a photograph that some of you may know. It was by the great Hungarian-French photographer Brassai. And it was a photograph that I'd known for a very long time. Some of you may have seen it. It's a photo of two women sitting in a nightclub in Paris in 1932. And one of the women is wearing a spangly evening dress, and the other woman is in drag. She's a cross-dresser. She's wearing a tuxedo. She's got a man's haircut and a pinky ring, and she's chunky and sort of terrifying looking. So, and that was all I knew about the photo. I just knew, it's a very strong image, and it was one that I'd known for a long time. So then there was a show here at the National Gallery in 1999, 2000, of Brassai's work. And there was a little wall text next to the photo, and it said that the woman in the tuxedo, whose real name was Villette Morris, had gone to work for the Gestapo during the Nazi occupation of Paris. And that was all it said. So I thought, really? And it was doubly shocking to me, I guess, because I thought I knew the photograph, but obviously there was a great deal I didn't know. So I went home and I looked on the internet, and now you can find reams of information and misinformation in a moment. And what I was able to find out was that Villette Morris had been an athlete, professional athlete, a French discus thrower, javelin thrower, Olympic hopeful, and a professional auto racer in the 30s. And in 1935, the French government took away her license to compete professionally because, for some reason, cross-dressing was in violation of the Napoleonic Code. Now, why Napoleon bothered with that, I don't. Anyway, there are lots of laws in France. So somehow Hitler found out about this fact, and despite his well-known persecution of, gay men, I mean, he seems not to have known that there were gay women, but gay men, he conquered his own distaste for her sexual preference and her fashion choices, and invited her to be his special guest at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And this was partly because she had this huge network of contacts. I mean, at that point, there were all these regional athletic groups, and especially women's regional athletic groups, because it was still quite rare for women to participate in various sports all over France. So she was in an ideal position to tell the Germans where there were troop movements, where there were movements of soldiers, materiel, and so forth, construction projects. So by the time she came back from being Hitler's guest at the Berlin Olympics, she was not only spying for the Germans, but she was the person who told the Germans where the Maginot Line ended so that they could invade France in June 1940. And when the Germans came into Paris, she did, in fact, go to work for the Gestapo as a torturer, and she was assassinated by the French resistance in 1944. This is all true. So, but, as we fiction writers say, you can't make this stuff up. And so it was such a crazy story that somehow I thought that I had to do it as nonfiction because no one would ever believe me if I put it in a novel. And I was all ready to start. And in fact, my book contract is for a nonfiction book about Brassai and Villette Morris. And then I had a drink with my then French editor, who said, "Oh, but the French, they're so sensitive about their collaboration history. You're going to have to spend 2 years in the Bibliothèque Nationale doing research." And I thought, I don't want to. So, and then I thought it would be much more interesting and much more fun and very liberating to do it as a novel instead of a nonfiction book. And it was. I mean, the difference between writing about the Berlin Olympics and writing about the Berlin Olympics from the point of view of a furious athlete, cross-dresser, full of resentment, who's suddenly being treated as a kind of minor celebrity, was all the difference in the world, and much more entertaining for me. So that's where the book began. But then it kind of expanded outward, because I realized that I couldn't write about France after everything went dark without writing about France or Paris, really, when it was still bright, when they were full of artists and writers and painters and so forth. And the book just kept getting bigger and bigger, much to my horror, because I thought it would be kind of I don't know, I never thought it would be simple, but I thought it would be manageable. It took 5 years to write. For the first 3 years, I spent saying, in total despair, working 12 hours a day and in total despair, saying, this is too hard, I can't do this, it's impossible. And then after about 3 years, I thought, well, it's too hard, but I can do it. So then, the last 2 years were still hard, but possible. And as the book grew, various other narrators came into the book. I mean, I knew, for example, that Brassai, the character in the novel is named Gabor, who is based loosely on Brassai. I knew that he was writing letters back to his family in Hungary. So the book started off with a series of letters that my photographer character, Gabor, is writing to his family in Hungary. And I realized pretty quickly that there were big pieces of the story that he couldn't possibly know. So then I had to figure out who would know these pieces of the story. So by the time I got through, there's something like 6 or 7 major narrators, different narrators. So Gabor, the photographer, is one. There's a character who's based loosely on Henry Miller, and who is a very close friend of Brassai's. And in fact, Brassai wrote a book about Henry Miller, and Brassai appears as a character with his name changed in some of Henry Miller's books. And so I got to write a kind of fake Henry Miller novel, which was shockingly easy. I mean, it was the easiest voice to do for me, which I couldn't have been more surprised, to get in touch with my inner Henry Miller writing it. So there's the photographer, there's Henry Miller, there's a baroness who's an art collector, a patron of the arts. She's supporting the photographer, and she's married to a manufacturer of luxury automobiles and race cars. So she becomes involved with the character based on Villette Morris, who I call Lou Villard, when she becomes a race car driver. There's a woman named Suzanne, who's the girlfriend and then the wife of the photographer, who becomes a resistance heroine. There's a third-person part, the only third-person part, about a woman named Yvonne, who's the owner of this club, the Chameleon Club, which is a cross-dressers club in Paris, which is in fact based on a real place called Le Monaco, which was a cross-dressers club. Brassai took a lot of photos there, and it turned out that the club existed, survived not only the war, but I was recently reading a biography of Jane Bowles, and it turned out that she used to hang out there in the 50s. So the club not only made it through the war, but lasted until the 50s. But the hardest part to write was the part about the parts from Villette Morris's, or Lou Villard's point of view, for all sorts of reasons, obvious reasons. I mean, you can't hear me? The rest of you can't hear me? Oh, you should have said. Can you hear me now? Can I turn this up? Can I talk, if I talk into it like that? I feel like Tina Turner. The part about Lou Villard, based on Villette Morris, was the hardest part to write, because she's the most Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. Because she's the most complicated character. And also, what I was interested in from the beginning was the way in which a relatively normal person becomes someone who's capable of doing real evil, which is what happened with her. So, and that was sort of the problem of the novel, what I was going to deal with. So I tried it all different ways. I tried her point of view in all different ways. I tried first person, I tried third person, I tried letters, and nothing was working. It just kept sounding artificial and unpersuasive and so forth. And finally, I asked myself, okay, what do I actually have about her? And what I had was this truly terrible French biography in French written during the 70s, completely bogus. I mean, you just couldn't tell what was true, what wasn't true. There was no bibliography, no footnotes, no nothing. And it was all full of like, she thought, blah, blah, she felt. I mean, how did the biographer know anything that she thought or felt? And I realized that what I could do, that the way I could do it, was to write my own bogus biography. So I invented a biographer. So the parts that are from Lou's point of view are a part of biography. And the biographer who became a character in the novel, whose name is Natalie, is a French high school teacher, feminist, extremely neurotic. A friend of mine said that when he read the book, he said, you can see the nicotine stains between her fingers as you're reading. And she just can't stop talking about her own problems. And as the book gets darker and darker, she becomes more and more self-obsessed. And it made it very easy for me because all my problems with the character became the biographer's problems with the character. So if I couldn't deal with it, she couldn't deal with it. It was too dark for me. It was too dark for her. And it was great. I didn't have to worry about it anymore. I had invented this fictional person. And also, sometimes she's a very good writer, and sometimes she's a not very good writer. And it was a great pleasure to write badly on purpose. I mean, it happens accidentally all the time. It's not that much fun. But to actually say, okay, here she's just going to go over the top. So that's essentially, and the book just got longer and longer. I mean, at one point it was 300 pages longer than it is now. And I gave it to a friend of mine to read, and because I had some idiotic idea that the characters had to have a regular rotation through the book, and he said, you don't have to do that. You just need the characters who advance the story through time. And I thought, hey, and the book lost 300 pages in one day. It's like dieting in the extreme. So I'm going to read you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to read a couple of short sections from the novel, and then to give you a sense of what the different voices sound like. So this is how the novel begins. You've all now disappeared. I hope you're still out there because I can't see. The novel begins with one of the letters that Gabor is writing to his family back in Hungary. Paris, May 14th, 1924. Dear parents, last night I visited a club in Montparnasse where the men dress as women and the women as men. Papa would have loved it. And Mama's face would have crinkled in that special smile she has for Papa's passion for everything French. The place is called the Chameleon Club. It's a few steps down from the street. You need a password to get in. The password is, police, open up. The customers find it amusing. A bar, a stage, a dance floor, leather banquettes, tables around the edges. A typical Paris nightclub except for the clientele. But here's the most surprising thing. The owner is Hungarian. She calls herself Yvonne. She's tall and blonde and dresses in red and has a weakness for sailors. She sings in that husky voice Papa adores, subdued and choked with tears. When she sang, I heard Papa's phonograph, muffled and locked in his study. Yvonne's song was about a woman whose sailor boyfriend has drowned at sea. I'd never heard a sadder song, not even from the gypsies. Yvonne sang with her eyes closed, one hand raking her hair. In her other hand, pressed to her forehead, she held an unlit cigarette. She sang, I will never see him again, never, never again. A mournful arpeggio rippled from the out-of-tune piano while the tenor saxophone looped circles around the voice. The other musicians put down their instruments and sat back, watching Yvonne. It's over, she sang, all over. I felt clammy and chilled to the bone, though the club was smoky and hot. I reached for my camera the way, as a boy, I used to reach for your hands, but I'd left it in my room. I was hoping to make a few friends before I asked to take pictures of bankers and diplomats whose wives might not know that their husbands go out dancing in high heels and dresses. Even after a year in Paris, it took some getting used to. The hardest part was not staring, or was I supposed to stare? Photographing these birds of paradise will be a challenge, don't you think? I was trying to communicate with nothing so obvious as a smile, but let's say a smile of the eyes, my admiration for the chic of women in tuxedos escorting women in evening gowns, as if these glorious peacocks cared what a penniless Hungarian artist thought of their fashion choices. Even Papa admits that the French have always had mixed feelings about anyone who hasn't lived in France since the Neanderthal era, though here in Montparnasse they like anything exotic. So Gabor, the photographer, finds Yvonne, the singer and owner, and asks to take pictures of the club. And she says no, because obviously people haven't come to the club to get their pictures taken, and discretion is very important. But she lets him come back. She's so glad for a chance to speak Hungarian with anyone that she lets him come back to her office. Don't worry, dear parents, you can read on. I swear my only desire was to photograph Yvonne and her clientele. It was entirely about my art, the basis of your faith in me and your generous stipend, the tuition you are paying to what Papa calls the art school of life, which will soon decide if I have what it takes to be an artist. Yvonne was right to say no. I would never have had the nerve to order a woman like that around for as long as it took to set up a shot in an office more like a courtesan's nest in Papa's Balzac novels. The cushions, the lacy garments tossed on the couch, the tangle of stockings and sandals exuded a flowery perfume, Yvonne's trademark gardenia. She pointed at a table on which there was a terrarium. Its glass walls were beaded with moisture. Inside, a miniature garden bloomed, complete with a tiny topiary and classical Greek statues. Versailles, I said. What a coincidence. I photographed there last week. Yvonne said, Are you blind? Mama, Papa, you know better than anyone what a visual person I am. How I learned my colors before any child in our town, how I could always find the potato bugs in Mama's garden, and was the first to spot Papa trudging home after a hard day of teaching. So you will understand how embarrassed I was by how long it took me to see the green chameleon standing perfectly still behind a thimble-sized statue of Cupid shooting his bow and arrow. This is why I've fallen so madly in love with this city. Despite the worries, despite my guilt for delaying Papa's retirement, despite the soul-destroying jobs, it still makes me dizzy with joy to see the word Paris in my handwriting at the top of this letter. Where else can one go to a cross-dresser's nightclub and meet a Hungarian chanteuse who keeps a lizard in the style of Marie Antoinette? Yvonne scooped up the reptile and pressed it to her breast. The quivering chameleon gradually turned the scarlet of her dress. She said, Look how little Louis matches my heart. Was this why Yvonne wore red? Was her club named after a lizard? I'd assumed it was a metaphor for her clients' changing skins. Yvonne said, Louis is not my first. That was my Darius the prince, my lizard killed by a jealous sailor. For Darius, I created a tiny Persian garden. She sighed with what I hoped was grief for her departed pet, and not impatience with a fool she wouldn't be bothering with except for the chance to speak Hungarian. She said, One night I was working out front. My friend, a German admiral whose name you would know, let himself into my office and put my darling Darius on my paisley shawl. He died, exhausted by the strain of turning all those colors. Yvonne said, My customers don't come here to get their pictures taken. I understand completely, I said. Thank you and good night. And I'm going to read you a little bit. I'm going to read you just the very beginning of the part of the biography. And the biography is called biography is called The Devil Drives. The Life of Lou Villard by Nathalie Dunois. Author's preface, The Mystery of Evil. I first heard the name of Louisiane Villard whispered when I was a girl, visiting my great-aunt Suzanne Dunois, the wife and later the widow of the photographer Gabor Tseigny. I remember hearing Lou's name and feeling a chill, as if the winter wind had blown open the door of my great-aunt's enviable Paris apartment, an old-fashioned artist studio with whitewashed walls, leaded windows, and a collection of modernist chairs that guests, especially children, were forbidden to sit on. For many years, all I knew was that Lou Villard was the woman in a man's tuxedo in Gabor Tseigny's photograph, Lovers at the Chameleon Club, Paris, 1932. Doubtless my readers are familiar with the portrait of the lesbian couple, the pretty girl in the sparkly gown sitting beside her broad-shouldered lover with pomaded hair and a man's pinky ring on her finger. Both stare into the middle distance with unfocused expressions, unreadable, or so I thought, until I began my labors on this book. I'd never understood why Lou Villard's name had so lowered the temperature in the room until I attended a 1998 show of Tseigny's work at the Centre Pompidou, to which I traveled from Rouen, where I'd been living and teaching for almost 20 years. The wall text for Lovers at the Chameleon Club explained that the woman in the tuxedo was a French auto racer named Louisiane Villard, who later spied for the Germans and collaborated with the Nazis. I shivered, just as I used to in my great-aunt's apartment. The chill lowered my defenses, and I caught a fever to understand. And so was planted the mutant seed that has grown into The Devil Drives, my message in a bottle. Throughout this long and unexpectedly demanding project, it has been a source of profound exaltation and even deeper despair to immerse myself in the dramatic and terrible life of Lou Villard, a pioneer in the field of women's athletics, a woman who insisted on her right to live like a man, an international celebrity who knew everyone worth knowing, but who, because of the crimes of her later years, as well as her violent death, has completely vanished from the memory of the living. It has been a duty and a privilege to resurrect the spirit of a woman buried by society, determined that stories like hers go untold. Even in the 1960s and 70s, when young French women like myself were exhuming every dead woman who ever picked up a paintbrush or conducted a science experiment or crossed a desert, everyone, even the female athletes entering the doors that Lou Villard kicked open for them decades before, even those women chose to let Lou remain forgotten in her unquiet, unmarked grave, possibly even a landfill. The story of this writing of this book is a tale of unanswered doorbells and letters, of phone connections gone dead, of records mysteriously vanished from libraries and archives. And what other explanation can there be for those roadblocks and silences than our nation's sensitivity about its World War II record, its willful erasure of the shameful truth about our historic past? How different this book would be if I'd had just 1 hour to sit down with Lou and ask her, woman to woman, face to face, who were you? What made you do what you did? And it goes on like that. And I'm going to read you one more paragraph, which I always lose. Oh, here it is. Okay, so this is from later. This is from much later in the book, and this is by the Baroness, the art collector, the patron of the arts, the wife of the race car manufacturer, and she also was writing her memoir. I should say that the voices in the book, except for one, everybody's writing something: letters, memoirs, biographies. So they're all kind of written documents of a weird sort. She's writing a memoir that will later become very popular. And her memoir, and the photographer has taken her picture, which is an iconic picture, and her memoir is called A Baroness by Night. I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs. From A Baroness by Night by Lily de Rossignol. If there is an afterlife, I hope they will throw a party for the angels who on earth were the subjects of famous photos. There will be a carousel for those tragic little girls who sat for Lewis Carroll, nourishing meals for the Dust Bowl families. The lovers Gabor shot in cafes can devour each other forever. We'll visit with Baudelaire and Bernhardt, courtesy of Nadar, and with that funny Lartigue lady wearing more fur than her dogs. No need to invite Louis-Laure and Arlette, who will be in hell. We will recognize one another, angels with faces fixed forever in black and white and 2 dimensions. There will be many things that we won't need to say, though I wish we would. I would like to know how the other angels felt when they saw their pictures, or when, just for a laugh, they read some critic's ruling on what their image meant. Is immortality a sufficient reward for being tethered eternally to one moment in a whole life? Thank you. You're back. So I'll answer questions. I'd be happy. And I should say, I'm reading the voices, so they don't, I hope, they all sound sort of the same because I'm reading them in my voice, but my hope is that they don't sound that much the same on the page. They're more distinct than that, I hope.
Does anyone have any questions?
I just have to say, in case you didn't see it, she's called the Hope Diamond by Michael Cunningham of the literary world. The Hope Diamond of literature. Like, you don't get to ask a question of the Hope Diamond every day.
Michael's a
I was
friend.
like, oh,
Michael's
question,
a friend of
question.
mine. Okay.
Of course, he wrote you a blurb, but
we
still.
owe each other favors. So.
So I haven't read the book because I just bought it, but one of the things you said in your comments was interesting to me in terms of writing a villainous character, just from a craft perspective, because it seems to me a sort of tension-fueled line for a writer to write a character who is bad and believable, and also not turn off the reader at the same time or have a reader be compelled by that character. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, that was the real challenge, and that was part of why I wanted to do it. Part of what I wanted to do was that it was so scary and intimidating to do that. Anyone can make a sympathetic character sympathetic. It's not that hard. They're like little puppy dogs. They just jump up in your lap. But to make an evil character or someone who does evil things sympathetic was really hard. But my feeling all the way through, first of all, was, she's a suffering human being like other suffering human beings who winds up making other people suffer. But also to look at the question that the biographer asked, why she did what she did. She, what I began to think was, here is a woman who only wanted a few things. She wanted to be loved like everybody does. She wanted to dress like a man, and she wanted to be a professional athlete. And she was denied pretty much all of those things. So, and also, I was reading a lot. I did a lot of research, most of which I forgot. But I was reading a lot about the origins of fascism and totalitarianism and what happened at the time. And of course, one of the things we all know that Hitler did was to tell the German people that they'd been stabbed in the back by the Treaty of Versailles, blah, blah, blah. So that sense of resentment and of having been betrayed and of things having gone wrong through no fault of your own makes one, I think, or a whole nation in this case, particularly vulnerable to the appeal of fascism. So here is a woman who felt that her life had just reached a dead end, and then she goes to Berlin and is suddenly treated like a star. And so you watch her transformation from just a kind of normal, difficult person into a truly evil person, little by little by little. But that was the challenge of writing the book. In his beautiful review, Ed said, well, it's a particular challenge because nowadays people assume that the character is the writer. But I don't really think that anyone assumes that I'm a Nazi torturer for the Gestapo. Let me say here now, I'm not. I'm not. So I didn't really worry about that. It wasn't a concern for me. But it was a concern to make her a human being.
Is it mine? Yeah. Oh,
It's right here.
okay.
There, you got it.
I'd be interested to know what and whom you read in your spare time.
What and whom I read in my spare time?
Yes.
I used to say that I don't get to read for pleasure anymore, but actually, one of the good things about the book tour is that I can read. I read, I don't have. So I've been reading. Okay, two things. One is, some of you may know I wrote this book called Reading Like a Writer, and in the back there are 118 books that I tell people that they have to read immediately. So that's, that would be part of it. And then lately, who have I been reading lately? I mean, speaking of Michael Cunningham, I'm reading, I have his new novel with me. I'm saving it for the most stressful moment of the book tour. The plane is delayed, the train sits on the Amtrak tracks forever. So I'm just hoarding it. I've been reading a lot of, there's a great Norwegian writer named Karl Ove Knausgaard who has just been, the third volume of his deeply strange and brilliant memoir novel has just come out, is coming out. So I've been reading him. I just read a great Italian novel that just came into my house in galleys called 3 Light Years. So, it's eclectic and wide and whatever I find that's interesting to me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will be delighted to report this evening of my son, who's a proud Bard graduate.
Yay! I teach. Should I explain? Oh well, I teach at Bard. It's my favorite place I've ever taught. It's really, it's a wonderful. And I teach literature, and they let me do whatever I want. So I have no complaints about a teaching job.
Did she know at the time she was converted by Hitler the depth of his evil? I remember from In the Garden of Beasts, a lot of people in that era did not really understand what was going on when they came over to the other side. Speak to that.
Well, it happened gradually. I mean, again, I've sort of by now forgotten how much is real and how much I made up. But let's just say this character, and I think a certain amount is, she was a French patriot. So at the very beginning, and a big devotee of Joan of Arc. So, everything, the wearing the armor, the not wearing the wonder dresses, the seeing herself as a leader of troops and so forth. So Hitler convinced her, or the Germans convinced her, that they were going to take France and purify it, of the enemies from within that had ruined the country, and give it back to the French. So she believed that to a certain extent. And then I think by the time she became a torturer, I don't think she could have had many illusions about what that she was doing something very violent and so forth. But by then, she was so deeply immersed in it that it was her life, in the way it was for people. So, but it's an endlessly interesting. Speaking of Bard, I taught a class there. My poor students were my guinea pigs. I taught a class about evil, about the literature of evil. So we started with the Book of Genesis, and we read through Beowulf and Macbeth, and then there's a marvelous book called Into That Darkness by Gita Sereny, and it's a book-length interview with the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, in which he just goes and asks that question, why did you do what you did? And it's fascinating, and I was, drawing on things like that I was reading all the time. So.
Hi, Francine.
Jackson.
Did Brassai know her in real life, or did he just take that picture and it was a casual thing? Did he ever find out who she was or anything like that?
He knew her. I don't think, I don't know if he knew what became of her, but he certainly knew her. And also, Brassai, one of the interesting things that I found out about Brassai was a lot of those photographs were actually staged, recreated versions of things he'd seen. So he did, in fact, build a replica of the club in his studio and invited people to come from the club to sit in the studio, and he would pretend that they were in the club. And there's a very famous photo by Brassai. And, again, what I knew about 20 things altogether. And so part of the process of writing the book was finding a way to connect these dots. So, for example, I knew that Brassai had taken this famous photo. It's a 4-part photo of a body, presumably a dead body, lying on the street in Paris, and and gathering a crowd around it, and then being taken away by a ambulance, and I needed to. And he had seen it, and then he recreated it. So I needed to know who posed for the body. I needed to figure that out, and I thought, you're not going to get your friends to do that, and you're not going to get your relatives. It had to be his girlfriend. So at that moment, the girlfriend popped on into the novel. So everything kind of evolved that way. And then the characters in the novel turned out to be interconnected in the way people are in life. You all know there's certain people you don't necessarily want in your life. They just happen to be in your life, and every time you turn around, they're there. I mean, well, I think many of the characters were that for one another.
Yeah, the other question I had is how much did you really have to go on in factual information about this woman?
As I said, about 10 things. I knew about 10 things. I mean, there's a transcript. She sued the government. She sued the French government to get her license back. And there is a transcript of the trial. So I had that. I mean, I had to translate it myself. So there's that. But not that much. I mean, I knew the major points of her life, but that was all. And I did have this biography, but I just couldn't tell how much of it was true or not. So I might as well make it, as I said, I might as well make it up.
A novelist's dream.
The novelist's dream.
A process question.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you write each day? What time of day do you write? How much rewriting do you do? How much contemporaneous research did you do for this book?
I just try and write every minute I can. I don't do anything else. I mean, I have a family and I try and have a life, but I have a very nice husband who does everything. I mean, I don't know how any of the appliances in my house work, so he does. I'll tell. I think I was on tour for the Caravaggio book, and I was in Boston, and I got horrible laryngitis, and I couldn't speak. And he was with me, and I said, we have no choice. I can't disappoint these people. You're going to have to read for me. So he read, and I sold more books than I ever sold in my entire. People would come up and say, God, I wish I could get my husband to do something like that for me. Well, he doesn't really have any choice. Anyway, I write a lot. I mean, but it depends what stage of the novel I'm at. I mean, I can't write a first draft more than a couple of hours a day. It's too exhausting. It's just too exhausting. But if I'm rewriting, I can work 10-hour days or 12-hour days. I revise constantly. The book, I started numbering drafts. So I have like 15 drafts that I know about. And I would say that each one of those number drafts represents probably 10 drafts. So the math, not my strong point. It's 150. So that'll be 150 drafts. Research, I read a lot. I just read a lot. I forgot a lot. I read a lot of books. I watched movies. I watched, the wildly boring Leni Riefenstahl film of the Olympics. I watched it over and over. And I did a lot of stuff there's a lot of stuff on YouTube you can find. I mean, there's an extraordinary amount of stuff, clips on YouTube that were taken during the period. That, you can watch the French countryside in 1924 from behind the wheel of a car driving through the countryside. You can there's a scene in the novel that's the last public guillotine execution in France. And I do not advise you to look at this. It's very unpleasant. I mean, there's a reason why it was the last one. But that's on YouTube. You can watch the film. So, between books, reading, movies, and YouTube clips, I did a lot. I have like 6 bookshelves this size in my study that just for the book. Yeah.
Okay. I assume you were writing before computers came into wide use. How's that changed your writing?
How has computers changed my writing?
Yeah.
It's a great blessing, obviously. I mean, I was writing. I mean, back in the day, I'd have these stacks that were the drafts, and it wasn't good because I would get to the point where I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I go, I just can't type it out again. No one will notice this part is really terrible, but now I can go and fix it, and it enables me to do all different kinds of. I don't know what I honestly don't know what I did before. I really don't. But it hasn't changed it for the worse, I don't think.
I actually have a question. Get to hoard a little bit more of your time. Teju Cole was here actually talking recently.
Another
just
colleague of mine at Bard,
wandering around. And one of the questions he got was about the fact that the ASCII did not enjoy, or the asker did not terribly enjoy one of the characters in his, the main character in Open City, and would he comment on that? And he, rather delightfully said, "I'm not here to make your black best friend. I'm here to write real people." It was great. But
I'm not here to make your torturer best
right,
friend.
exactly. So sort of going off of that, and there's recently been a very enjoyable book called Hitler's Furies, sort of.
Oh, I read that book.
Yeah. And I think part of the draw sort of this book is the added gender role here that's happening, in addition to her own gender identity, but also the added sort of horror we still get about women behind horrible acts of evil. I was just interested in how much sort of writerly pleasure did you get, in addition to, yes, I'm going to make a character that you're still going to keep reading,
Right.
but how much did you, was there any writerly pleasure in being like, no, this is this person, and I'm not here to write your torturer best friend?
I wasn't. Well, no, there was great pleasure in it. I mean, and listen, there's there's a dinner party with Hitler in the novel, which was more fun than anything. I mean, and for that, I mean, there's this very weird book called Hitler's Table Talk, that because Bormann wrote down everything Hitler said at dinner. I mean, shatteringly banal. And he went on about his dietary habits forever. So, yeah, I mean, but I've never sort of believed. I mean, I think of myself as a feminist, obviously, but I also know there was such a person as Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi and Hitler's Fury. So I felt no impulse to write no reason why I couldn't write a female character who is just as wicked as any male character. I didn't. Again, human beings come in every. I mean, oddly enough, my German editor, my agent ran into him, and he said that he was quite nervous about the book, and I thought, yeah, well, I would be too. And he said no, that it wasn't the German people, that he was worried about gay and lesbian readers and who have become very politically active, and I thought, what are you telling me, that just because of one's gender orientation means you're a good person? That can't possibly be true. So, again, it wasn't my problem.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Any other questions before we start signing?
Thank you so much.